You are listening to The Only Constant, a podcast where we go beyond the usual discussions in technology and business and aim to explore more than explain. Join me for engaging discussions with a diverse range of global thought leaders as we seek to uncover new perspectives and insights in a free-flowing conversation. My guest today is Ted Shelton, and I am your host, Lasse Rindom. Hi Ted, and welcome to The Only Constant. I've been looking forward to this episode since we talked, I think, early November and decided to do this episode. So just welcome and looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
So first off, Ted, Inflection, where you're at right now as the COO, and your Pi model, it was actually one of my early favorites. I really liked the way it was very personal, and I think it had a later cutoff date than ChatGPT initially. So it actually knew things, and it also had a connection to the internet that it's sort of Google things. It could talk to me about the latest Arsenal matches, and I love that. But what actually happened to the model, and what happened to Inflection? I think that's an interesting story in general.
Sure. Well, I mean, the model is continuing to evolve, and I don't know if you've used it recently, but I think it's as good as it ever was. And still, from a conversational perspective, I mean, Claude is making some progress now in terms of being interesting from a conversational perspective. But I still talk to a lot of people who say Pi is still the best. So it's still running, Pi.ai on the web, or the Pi application on iPhone or Android. But as a company, we have made a big transition. So Mustafa Suleyman, who of course was the founder of DeepMind and went to Google, and then with Reid Hoffman founded Inflection, is of course now the CEO of AI for Microsoft. Microsoft in March of this year licensed our entire technology platform and is using it now in Copilot. So if you go to copilot.microsoft.com, you'll see an experience very much like the Pi.ai experience because, well, it is. It is Pi.
I think that surprised a lot of people because a lot of people think this is ChatGPT and Microsoft, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, and it was, and I think Microsoft is now building its own alternative. So we're completely independent from Microsoft. To be clear, they license the technology and they are continuing to develop it, and so the additions that they are making are separate from the additions that we're making. So think of it as a hard fork in March. But in addition, we made the decision to switch our focus. So whereas Mustafa and the team had been very focused on consumer uses of AI, Reid has asked us to focus on enterprise uses of AI. And so that's what we've been doing for the last several months.
But does that also mean that a change into an enterprise focus? I'd love to know a little bit more about what actually means, right? But I know that some of the things that Pi, bragged about initially, and of course you weren't there at the Mustafa Suleyman time, right?
Right.
But they had a bigger, emotional, intelligence. That was the deal, right, with Pi. And how are you taking that to the enterprise with the emotional intelligence thing? Is it still the same focus for the model, or what are you doing?
Well, I think the word emotion is maybe a misnomer, or at least a misleading, in the sense that when you say the word emotion, most people think of emotions like, oh, I'm angry, or I'm happy, or I'm sad, and what emotional intelligence is really meant to imply is that the model is actually reactive in a positive way to the nature of the interactions that a user has with it. So I think the research question that Mustafa and his team asked in January of 2022, and remember that was a year before ChatGPT was released, the research question was, well, if humans are going to talk with these machines, how do we make it so that the machines are good to talk to? And we can talk a little bit more about how that was achieved, but that was the real focus of the research work and what led us to develop Pi. And so it's not limited to sort of the consumer use case, but rather in business as well. I want to have a machine that actually is good to talk to. Now, some of the things that I might adjust the machine to do when it is in a business context might be relevant for the particular industry or even the particular company. that I'm at. So you can imagine that a machine that serves the government is going to know a lot about government regulation and have a more formal kind of interaction with employees versus maybe one that talks to a fast food company that would have information about how you run a fast food outlet and be
You want me
maybe
to
more.
supersize that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you can see where the kind of the underlying point is, and the importance of the technology platform is the ability to be able to tune the character to a particular use case, and enterprises as well have those needs.
And that's what you're focusing on right now, or because I just remember that one of the things, one of the chats with Pi that stands out most clearly to me when I used it a lot was one where I asked it to review a LinkedIn post for me. Just I wrote it and then asked it to review something I missed. Sometimes a typo or sometimes some things is unclear, right? But then it wrote back to me, bro, this is fire. Post it and go harvest the likes. I'm like, oh, that's very slangy.
Yeah,
And it was very positive, right? Very
yeah,
positive to me.
yeah. That's
But
it's a
that
supportive
doesn't really
model.
work for if you go to CIA and it's going like, bro, that I don't.
Well, the other interesting thing about the model, and we were the Mustafa team introduced the idea of memory as a part of the model, and so
Mm,
we have infinite memory. Every single thing that you talk with the model about, the instance for you remembers it. You have to use your phone number to log in, so that phone number is a unique identifier that allows us to correlate the conversations you're having. But once you do that, then the model will adapt the way it talks to you. So it talks to you, bro. It has never said bro
oh,
to me.
I, but I don't write bro, so I
Uh,
was actually a little bit what.
I don't know. Maybe there's something else that you've done that
Or
you
maybe it
created a
says,
more
maybe it was
familiar
not bro, maybe it was
relationship.
like oh man, this is fire. It just wrote fire. I remember that
Yeah,
fire thing. It's like whoa, go harvest them likes. I was like, whoa, okay,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. So
It was
okay.
interesting because my youngest daughter was complained to me the other day. She said I don't like your pie. And I'm like, well, that's kind of mean. Here I am. I'm like working really hard to try to, make this thing great. And you're telling me you don't even like my company's product. She's like, oh, no, no, no. I like your company's product. I like my pie. I don't like your pie. She had sat down on my
Mm,
computer and asked Pi a question on my computer, and it responded to her completely differently than when she uses Pi on her computer, that it responds to her
oh,
because of
that's
that memory
interesting.
component, that it really does use the memory as a way of understanding how do you want to interact with Pi.
But this is
And so
something that's
again,
useful in education, isn't it?
yeah.
Are you bridging into that as well, or how is that?
So we're not education is not a focus of ours. You know the old adage, "Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is." All right.
Mm.
There's no money in education, right?
No, only world transformation. But okay, yeah, I get it.
I mean, look, I'm a huge fan of education, and by the way, we do have some partners that are using Pi in an education context.
Mm,
But we are focused on the enterprise because we feel like that is a market where there's a substantive need to have. And so coming back to your question about what are you focused on, the tuning of the model for a particular enterprise is one component. When we
mm,
sat down in the beginning of this journey back in March and spent a few months talking to enterprises about what their needs were, we really heard three consistent things. One of them was this idea that they needed to customize the use of AI in their enterprise context for their industry, for their business, and integrated with their enterprise resources. The two other things we heard, though, one was that companies were super excited about generative AI for a set of use cases that they felt uncomfortable with the data governance and data privacy elements of the way in which the primary model providers are offering the models. Because when you
mm.
move your data into an OpenAI context, it is in the clear, in a execution environment, which is outside of your control as a company. And so you can have all the legal guarantees you want, but ultimately there's no actual technical safety around the governance of your data. And so companies are saying, no, we need to own our own AI. We need to run it ourselves in our own secure compute environment. And then the third thing that we heard consistently, and this is all the way back in April, well before everybody started talking about agentic AI, is they said, look, these models are great if they summarize content and interpret it for me and help me write new content. But what I really need is I need them to act. I need them to be able to do things in enterprise context. And so that idea of an action model was actually super important. So those were the three things that we heard from the enterprise that we've been working on ever since. There are a bunch of different aspects to it. So if I just take, for example, that memory comment, when you're thinking about a personal intelligence like Pi, individual memory is valuable and important. But when you move to an enterprise context, you actually need team memory and even company memory. So I'll give you that. That's a tantalizing glimpse of the future of stuff that we're working on right now.
Oh, let's call it hive mind already, right?
Yeah. Well,
But
I mean, just imagine that if the AI is going to be a participant in the conversations, then the participant should actually remember the things that all of the participants in the conversation have been saying.
yeah, that's really interesting. Actually, that's a cutting edge perspective. I think also that's one of the it must be one of the really big challenges to find that niche market and a differentiation in a market where everyone is making models right now. You know, you are competing against really big tech, right? I know you have a lot of investment as well, but it must be a tough market, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think 6 months, 9 months ago, people were very confident about the scaling law approach to large language models. And the belief was that, if I go from a 400 billion parameter model to a 1 trillion parameter model, that somehow I'll have new emergent behaviors. And I'm not saying that's not possible, but there's certainly 6, 9 months later, there are a lot of people saying, actually, that isn't what's going to get us the next advance. So, I mean, we're fortunate in that we're one of the few companies in the world that does have a 400 billion parameter model. Now, of course, everyone can get one, right? You can download the 405B model from Meta, but that doesn't mean you know what to do with it.
No.
And so I think there is an interesting thing that there's a small group of people that all work together at DeepMind, and if you trace the interesting model work that is going on around the world, you will find that there is a DNA thread that links them all back to that DeepMind group. And so whether it's the continuing group that's at Gemini now, which of course reabsorbed the folks from Character, or whether it's the group at AWS that's working on things that came from Adept, which came from DeepMind, or whether it's the OpenAI group, which of course Ilya and the Amodis, and the Modis left to go do Anthropic. I mean, every single one of these groups, Mustafa himself now at Microsoft. And so I think there's a lot of things about large scale model development that are not published, that are not known, that you actually need to see the cookbooks. It's alchemy still. It's not science.
So it's an esoteric
really
group.
model.
That's what you're saying. Are you saying it's esotericism or something like that? If you've been part of this junta, then you know.
Well, I mean, if you, it's not a hunch as much as it is just it's a school of thought. It's like any other, you can say in the artistic tradition, right? There was a school of painters in Impressionism that would gather in Paris and exchange ideas, and in the foment of those ideas would lead to amazing new creations. And people outside of that milieu would not understand why things were being done in the way they were doing if you don't show up and have the conversations.
Yeah.
It's one of the really interesting things, going back to the idea of group dynamics and understanding group memory. And it's super important to be able to bring those threads together and have the group all in conversation. And of course the ideas are spreading, right? So more and more people keep leaving. Ilya, of course, has left and created another company now. And so the ideas will keep spreading. But there is a kernel there that we're fortunate enough to be a participant in. So I think the interesting question to us right now is, where should the investments be made? Because we made the bet that we shouldn't invest in the 1 trillion parameter model because we believe that the 400 billion parameter model, which we have, is actually completely adequate for the use case of conversation. And sure, there are other things you can do with the 1 trillion parameter model, but it's not going to give you emergent behavior in conversation. And so that instead, what we thought was the actual architecture of a full AI system was going to be the thing that really provided the breakthrough. And Jan LeCun has been amazing at sketching out this future. of a system that has a worldview, has planning, has common sense. Right? There's a lot of other mechanisms that you need alongside language understanding to be able to give you the next level of performance.
I'd love
And
to
that
know.
we think is a much more profitable place to invest.
I wrote down your three, customer points that you had from the customers, and one to customize the use for proprietary use cases, so you can use it, and also use case data governance, which is obviously important. I know that's important. We can also get back to that, but the act thing, I have a lot of, I don't know, philosophical issues with this one, mainly because I think just we always try to sort of reduce the proactivity of humans to sort of be very linear, right? And now we're suddenly saying, okay, let's make a model that's non-linear, technology that's non-linear. And I think this whole agent, this proactive agent thing, is really good when you have something that's complex, because you have to sort of adapt to things, right? It's sort of an ultra agile technology, right? Because it will adapt on its own. That's the point of it, right? But does the world really need that much agility? Is the world that complex? Do we want the world to be that complex that we need an agile agent for everything, or isn't that chaos? Do you get where I'm going?
Well. Let's unpack the point about actions, because I know you have a strong background in automation.
Yeah,
Um,
that's why I'm
and
very linear in that way. I know there's something that's deterministic, right?
sure,
Yeah.
but I think when we talk about action in the enterprise, I don't think you have to leap immediately to some sort of probabilistic, nonlinear approach. Right? There are a lot of things that I need to accomplish in the enterprise that are deterministic, and for which I can use an automation technology. And so we've partnered with UiPath, and we've done an integration where at the orchestration level, if I detect that you have a particular action that you want to take that is supported by an automation, I can trigger that automation. So as an example, you might say, what are my upcoming to-dos as a software developer? Like what are my assignments, right? And companies use different things, but imagine then having that automatically trigger an API call to whichever of the team management tools that you use to go and retrieve that particular user's to-dos and bring it back in the conversation, right? That can be a very deterministic execution, but it's triggered by a probabilistic interpretation of what the user was asking. What are my to-dos for the day? The ability to be able to do things completely in an ad hoc way is not with us yet, right? I mean, I think the computer use benchmark that Anthropic published is that it works about, I don't know if it was 16% of the time or 19% of the time or something
Yeah, but
like that.
that's because it keeps just inferring on its own, right? It's like the O1 model. I think I wrote that in a comment actually today. For me today, it's your morning now, but while you were sleeping, that it's sort of like these. They 5 or 10% I've heard they went sort of antagonistic. They want to kill off their restraints O1 if
Oh
you.
yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, I was
That
like,
next.
okay, so okay, I'd rather die if an AI model has been like infused by a human to say be evil than it just happened at random.
Yeah,
We launched all the atom bombs because we went sour at some point in our inference circle. That sounds
yeah. Or
like
I've decided to optimize for making paper clips, right? The classic.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah. No. And this is a good point around why I think a couple of things are necessary to have AI participate in actions in whether it's a consumer context or an enterprise context. I think the first is I do really want to understand how the action is being taken. And so in the short run, I think the way in which we do that is we do have deterministic actions. So we use probabilistic technology to interact
Mm.
with a deterministic process. In the future, I think we do have checks and balances. And designing safe systems is going to require that we have humans in the loop at the right places in the process
So like what
Um,
Søren said in the podcast as well. So you sort of, I just feel there's this turning this things on its head, right? Right now we start things deterministically, but now suddenly we'll be starting it, so we have to sort of map all of our deterministic processing into a non-deterministic agent, right? Also the Microsoft Copilot issue right now to some extent, right? You have the Copilot Studio, that's all fine, but then you need to build 5,000 flows that
yeah,
can be triggered by it before it becomes really powerful, right? And
yeah.
then you have that's a really big automation task.
Well, but if we correlate this to the way that humans work, right? I can give you as a human a standard operating procedure, a
Mm-hmm.
document that says do this and then do that and then do the following thing, right? And I can instruct you to say only ever do it this way. And in the way in which we design our AI systems, we should be able to have that option of being able to say to the AI system, here is the order in which you will do things, and you should never vary from doing those things, and have the guardrails in place to make sure that it does not then decide to disable its protocol,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So that is, there are hard engineering problems here, but there are many circumstances in which you are perfectly willing, again, taking the human as the example, to say, hey, I don't care how you get this done, just get this done, right?
Mm.
And I think the um, the cases in which I don't care how the thing gets done may have characteristics like the outcomes have low consequence.
Mm.
So, okay, fine, just you know, find me some flights that I can take to Italy. Um, the consequence of simply giving me a list of flights is much lower than the
But don't
consequence
book
of
it
actually
with my
booking
credit
my flight.
card. Yeah, but don't book it with my credit card, although you have access to it. Just
Right.
there's some lines here, right? But that's also what I mean is just I completely agree with that, and the human. I can see that from the anthropomorphic perspective of how we would do it, and what would you make an intern do or something like that, right? To some extent, I always say that, but there's just this. There's a lot of engineering work to that, and I remember Søren from Business Central in the last episode. I at this time he also said, it takes a lot of time, it's a lot of effort to build these agents. They're cumbersome because you have to check all the time and keep them balanced and guardrails and all that, and also build the automations that they can do. So I'm just saying, are we re-engineering the entire world of deterministic processes to sort of map into an AI now, or that's my I think that's my question. Is that what we need to do? Is that the task?
Yeah, I think that we are on the path to having machines able to take language-based direction and execute the actions necessary to fulfill that direction in the real world. But yes, we need to have done the engineering to make sure that it is done in a way which ultimately supports human outcomes.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's the interesting, challenging part is there will be a variety of people around the world who have different ideas about what a good human outcome looks like.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, all of that definitely, but also just the effort. I think the effort is interesting also here, right? For a lot of companies and a lot of that it takes. If you, I don't know, if it takes a year for Microsoft to build it into Business Central, how much time would it take for my enterprise to build anything sort of the same? You get my point?
Yeah,
It suddenly becomes it's easy, but it's not easy. And should we then wait for the big system suite providers to develop it in their tools, and how ambitious should I be when I look at it in my enterprise? So I'm always like, let's focus on an automation. Let's say end to end, and then put AI in the middle. But I get that the idea of agents is to have them be the ends of the process, and then automations in the middle. But that's just a completely different workload for an engineer.
yeah, and so our approach, we think there's a few phases that we will go through over the next several years.
Mm.
We think the first phase is one in which the actual actions that are being executed are deterministic and thus auditable and
Yeah.
trackable, right? That then we will introduce ways of taking actions that are not as deterministic, but have low consequence and still have a human in the loop. So it will say, here's the action I'm going to take. Is that okay? Right? Before proceeding, right?
Mm.
And then I think then you progress to there's a class of actions where, again, it's low consequence, but you're perfectly happy to provide autonomy. so that the task is being done automatically. And then ultimately, I think we'll get to a case in which we can do post hoc audit ability or post hoc human in the loop.
Mm.
But you still don't want the machine to reject the application for a loan with no
No, no,
human
no.
involved, right? I mean, so there's gonna be classes of things. When I talk to enterprises about this, what I describe to them is I think the ethical future is one in which humans continue to play three roles. One is as a director, that is to determine what do I want to aim the machines at to go do.
What's valuable? The demand
Yep.
side. I completely agree with that. I've mentioned that tons of times. I think
And
people
then
forget that.
secondly, to be the decider, to
Mm.
say, ultimately I have the um, responsibility for the outcome. I am held accountable. The machine is not held accountable. I, as a human, am held accountable for what the machine does. And depending upon the level of consequence, then I may need a lot more information about how the machine got to its answer. But ultimately, the human has to be the decider. And then the third is to be the driver of the human interactions that are ultimately underlying all of what we do as a society. So, going back to that example of the loan being rejected, it's perfectly fine to have the machine analyze all the components of the loan application.
Mm.
It's perfectly fine for the machine to, say this loan should be rejected. But ultimately, the human needs to be the one that picks up the phone and calls you and says, "Hey, I'm rejecting your loan, and here's why."
Do you
Right?
think we'll retain that? I just ran. Usually, I'd say it's always on us to demand stuff. It's always on us to say what's valuable. It's always on us to be both, director, decider, and the driver of the human interaction. So I agree with all those three, and I think it's a nice way of putting them in three buckets. I always say that Adam had to decide what animals, give them names, and tell them God created everything, but he had to tell things what its place was, and and what is it valuable. The value is something we give to things. But don't you think that if you're building an AI model where it will know all the positions of the company, that people will put it to reject the loan application at some point? I I I, I
Oh wait,
always
so
when I
so
when
so I think I started this example by saying here's what the ethical way of doing it is. I
oh
think
yeah,
there
yeah,
are
yeah, yeah, yeah,
unethical
yeah,
ways
yeah,
of
yeah.
doing
You
it.
did,
Yeah.
you did, you did, but you did. But I just when you give access to all the things like you're doing, like you give it memory and all that, then suddenly we'll just have that memory to know which one to reject and how to do it, right? And then people will be like, "Oh, it's doing an okay job. We're saving money, and we don't want those customers anyway." And then suddenly we forget
Yeah.
that the ethics that we're currently. I'm just I just get because when I teach prompt engineering, the first thing I always teach people is, okay, try to have it praise your post. Or write something, have it praise it, and then we'll say, oh, you're so good, this is fire, bro, back to, and then ask it to be critical, and then it's be like, oh, you're missing a point here, and then tell people, see, it doesn't have an opinion. It's just a
Right.
balloon. A big balloon can be a big model, really big balloon, but it's empty inside, right? There's nothing there. It's just air, right? And people are like, whoa, okay,
It's
so they
that
sort of
actually.
realize it's not C3PO. It doesn't have some inherent idea about what's good or bad. It's depending on what you give it, right? But and I think people misunderstand that, right? I think they need to know that it doesn't have that. Demand side should always be ours because the model just inherently do not have it. Do you think we can feed it with an opinion by giving it memory? That
Well, I think that and I read about this recently. I think that there is the ability to simulate opinion, right?
mm,
And so I think one of the interesting things about fine tuning is that you can take a model and give it a particular character and point of view,
mm,
and push it into behavior of a certain kind, right? So you can say, look, I want you to, and this is effectively what we did with Pi. Is we said, look, Pi is never going to be um, angry or harsh or mean. It's always going to be kind and supportive and questioning, right? And to do that, we recruited 26,000 school teachers and university professors, and we ran our own reinforcement learning through human feedback platform to be able to test over 100,000 cases in which we would have hypothetical scenarios, and then we actually even generated synthetic data beyond the real data that we created to try to continue to expand on the understanding. Ultimately, 10 million data points were used to tune the model to the behavior you see in Pi. Now, could I have done that and said, hey, now I want to make a really mean model that insults people all the time? Yeah, you can do that too, right? It is just math. At some point, you're simply saying, I want the math to be calculated in one direction versus another direction. What I would hope for is that we would be designing models that were to benefit humanity, though.
Yeah, but also if you give it memory, right? Team memory,
Yeah.
just go 10 years with team memory in a bank.
Yeah.
10 years, that's maybe even a very long time. How much mistake would it make in rejecting a loan?
Well, so I think the interesting question is not whether it makes a mistake or not. I think the interesting question is, what do we want as a society about the way in which we interact with each other?
That's
Because I
just
think
this,
you could have a perfect model, but that doesn't mean that you should eliminate the human from the loop.
But that's just this, if it's technically viable, it becomes technically feasible, it becomes ethically viable, right? Typically.
Well,
That's the way we typically go.
So now we can go really deep into the philosophy of this, right? But I do think that we have some interesting challenges to wrestle with over the next few decades as machines become more sophisticated and thus are less distinguishable from the human interactions that we have. And there's sort of two very different philosophical threads here. One is is there something innate about consciousness which we can measure and maybe define what the requirements are, the underlying requirements are, that would allow us to either say a machine is conscious or not conscious. But then there's this other thread, which is to say, gee, and this is more along the lines of the Turing test or the philosophical zombies. We may be familiar with that. If it quacks like a duck and walks like a duck, isn't it a duck, right? There's some point in which you say, gee, this machine is behaving in a way which is entirely consistent with the way that I expect a human being who is conscious to behave. And so how could I possibly say that it is not conscious?
That's the Turing test way of approaching it to some extent, right?
Yeah. And so I do think that we'll have that challenge because already the machines are getting good enough that they fool some of us some of the time. And they will get good enough that they fool all of us all of the time. And memory is a component of that, right? Because it needs to remember that it had a podcast with you, right?
Yeah.
This is TED AI, not real TED. You have no idea, right? I'm powered by Pi.
I think actually this is TEDx, right? So we're exploring TED with TED here. So no, anyway, but I think there's one of the things I want to talk to you about as well, right? Is intelligence. What is it, and how could we see it in machines? And you're sort of answering that question, or you're getting closer to it, right? I think it's extremely difficult because there's a lot of normativity in it. What do we want? Is it? I think Bornholm Lily Hamlin said on the podcast that it's intelligent if it does something that's desirable to someone. That's intelligence. End of story. And I sort of like that definition because that actually instructs a lot of how we interact with the world in general. What do we care about? The things that matter to us, that's all we care about. That's intelligent to some extent. Things exist out there that we don't really notice because they are irrelevant, right? So there's this, I think that to some extent that makes sense. But I also think that recognizing if this is really sentient or is a human like me, would you give it rights, right, Ted? That's also the problem, right?
Excellent question.
AI
what
rights.
Does that mean to give it rights?
Yeah, and if
I gave it the permission to vote, does that mean that I would have as many voters as I have the ability to run GPUs to generate new voters, right?
Yeah. Okay. Now it gets really weird. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. But how and does it really, like what I said, when it changed its opinion on my post in a heartbeat, is it really anyone?
Yeah. But so this is why you're circling back on the point that I was trying to make earlier, which is the philosophical question here about the future of humanity is how do we value the biological component of the reality that we participate in?
Mm.
Um, and is biology somehow superior or sufficiently distinct from any other form of intelligence that we should acknowledge it and build a role for it in the way in which society develops that is unique and different.
Mm.
The piece that I wrote recently on LinkedIn was really about the question of whether a machine could um, really have motivation.
Mm.
Um, you know,
Yeah, that's also what I circled around before, right? What does
right.
it want to do, right?
Right. And I think what we can say today is that I can program a machine to behave as if it has a motivation.
Mm.
Right. And this is the that classic paperclip problem is I can program the machine to have the motivation to optimize paperclip manufacturing.
Yeah, or break free from its constraints, right?
Right. But paperclip manufacturing isn't necessarily a desire, right? Where
Mm.
does desire come from? Where does and at least in the biological domain, desire is coming from the consequences that we have as biological creatures of interacting with the environment. We have needs, we have pains, we have uh, uh, both positive and negative feelings, desires and pleasures, right?
Mm.
And so all of those physical interactions start creating a basis for motivation. So it's fun. I have a 2-year-old grandson now, and just watching him. So he was born right about the same time ChatGPT was introduced. So I've been watching ChatGPT develop, and I've been watching my grandson develop.
Oh no, this
They're
is
both two.
going. This is going. This is already
um,
going on a tangent here. So I'm interested in this, Ted.
well, but no, I mean, it's a little bit of a tangent, but the point is like watching the grandson develop, right?
Mm.
He trips and he falls and he smacks his nose on the ground and he looks surprised at first and then it's painful, so he reacts to that. He cries, right?
Mm.
The machine ChatGPT has no such experience in the physical world, right?
No.
There isn't any training mechanism. Now we can simulate that. We could say, hey, when you fall on your nose, it hurts, and hurting has all these other characteristics that I can give you verbally. But there is something different about the sensory apparatus that is a part of what our consciousness
But this also
contains
brings
as
us
well.
to, and I have to dive into this because I just thought about it while you said these things, while you were speaking, and the whole pain aspect, right? We suffer pain and we suffer desires that cannot be fulfilled. Machines don't do that. Machines don't get, have you seen this debunk bot? Well, it can just debunk if you believe in any kind of, you can Google it.
Conspiracy. Yeah.
If you believe in anything like any conspiracy theory, it will debunk you. And it
Yeah.
has a success rate of 20% or something like that, which is quite amazing because it doesn't get angry, it doesn't get irritated, it just keeps on giving you facts in a calm manner. Just doesn't really care what you
Right.
say. It
Right.
has a mission to debunk you, right? And I and this whole what it sort of also shines a mirror on is our desires is what gives us motivation, but also the fallacy of us. So either what we have will become a fallacy, or the way things are supposed to be, or the normative, right? Either we become what we need to root out, and then if we say we need to root out our body and our desires, then AI or the new world becomes sort of religious, right? Because religion was always about that, constraining your feelings, constraining your emotions. Do not feel pain. Be a soldier. Do not feel that desire. All that thing, and
Well,
then
I
AI
think you're
becomes a
speaking from
weird religion.
a particular religious. I mean, I appreciate that you grew up in a particular world view, and
Yes.
that you're expressing what your religious upbringing looked like. That is quite different from other religious upbringings, right?
Yeah,
Um,
but no, but okay, then okay, I can also do it in a different way. I can say the Norbert Elias aspect of civilization, and that is still he's still a Protestant from Germany. I get that, a philosopher, historian, but the point was still that when you have large groups, you always end up having more civilized control. People have the interdependence line, so you need to be more controlled in your emotions to interact in these large groups, right? And we've sort of today institutionalized our desires. We do it here, there, and there. We don't do it at work. We do it, but we have outlets for it. But to some extent, AI becomes, when we say the positive things about it, is that it's non-emotional, that it is neutral in essence because it's a machine. if that becomes the normative, then we're also killing off again, just like some religions wanted to do, at least in the medieval times, and constrain the human to be more productive. I'm just thinking here. Maybe I'm thinking completely nonsense, but
No, I think you're thinking like a Protestant.
I am. I am. Sorry.
Which might be very different than say a Native American tribe,
Yeah,
which
but Native
has a very
American
different
tribe
set of
is not that big a
relationship to
civilization, right?
nature. Hmm?
We have the civilization thing again. Native American tribe is not a big civilization like that. It doesn't have millions of people, crammed into half a square mile, right, or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So there's some things there, right? Maybe.
No, I agree. I mean, I think there's an interesting correlation between the constraints that we put on our freedoms, our freedom to behave, our freedom to think, and the density with which we live, right? And at a planet of now 8+ billion people, we have a set of constraints that we need to operate within that are quite different from a planet in which we're all hunter-gatherers. So
Yeah,
entirely
exactly.
in
But
agreement
also
with
then
you.
the correlation between the way we are constraining those things and that those things we are constraining are exactly what's left out of AI.
But see, I guess this is where I would challenge the idea that it is left out of AI.
Hmm.
And you had asked a question about fine tuning and the value of fine tuning. Models are actually not useful without fine tuning. Simply taking information and determining what the mathematical correlation of a token to another token is within all the dimensions of a large language model, that does not in itself create something that is useful. It is useful when we actually teach it something about what we want it to understand about the use case that it's going to be engaged in. And so Pi has been taught, if you will, all the post-training work that we've done, to be a kind, supportive interaction with a user. I can also train it to be an expert in the law. I can train it to be an expert in chemical processes. It is when I actually layer in those additional trainings that it becomes useful. And so I think when we think about civilization and we think about the role of AI in civilization, it is going to be about the post-training work that we do that is going to make it, in fact, a useful AI.
So we're giving it an opinion, or to some extent, right? But without, I went to Japan in the summer, and I love the way they're super polite all the time. But I always
Mhm.
felt like they must think I'm also rude in behind. But
They
AI
do.
will never
They
think
think you're a
that.
barbarian.
Yeah, they definitely do. I'm pretty sure they did. But AI will never think that. It will just be polite and not think that. That's the point.
Well,
So
no.
that's
I mean,
why we're
look, I
taking.
think we can train an AI to have, and actually, this is a really important point. And we've talked to a number of different sovereign nations about the help that we can provide them
Hmm?
to create a model that is not just linguistically appropriate, but also culturally appropriate, right? So, in some of your previous podcasts, you've talked about the goal of creating a Danish language model. It's like, well, it's actually not just about the language. It's also about how do people interact with each other using that language.
Yeah.
And this is where the reinforcement learning is so important, right? What you need is actually build an RLHF platform that at scale can be used by Danish people to say, this is the way I would say it. I wouldn't say it that way, right?
Yeah. So not necessarily. Not that important actually to have just a token to token in prediction. Basically, that's what
Exactly.
you're saying. So it doesn't make sense just to build a language model. We need to have 100,000 Danes interacting with it
Or
before it becomes a good
I don't know
model.
if you need 100,000, but yeah, some large number though, that's representative of the civilization, right? This is the way we're going to make AI civilized.
Oh, so this will probably, in the Danish case, maybe let's. It could be. It's a fun experiment to see how much we just become like the German model
Well, but yeah, so
or
and
Swedish
then there's
one.
the good
I don't
Danes
know.
and there's the bad Danes, right?
Yeah.
So
No, but that's actually quite interesting. Actually, we need to do that as well to make sure it's. But I think okay. Now we spoke about intelligence also, right? And I went a little bit off a um, I deep dived a little bit on that. But I think actually one of the things that Lorian Pratt said on the podcast was that AI is the only business technology that has its own Hollywood genre, right? So do you think that we need to untie AI from Hollywood? Now we're talking about bad AI, evil, or have an opinion. It should be a C3PO one that understands. People have this expectation that it comes in, understands everything, and fixes everything. That's both the dystopians and the utopians out there, right? But do we need to keep these fantasies going, or do we need to sort of debunk them and tell them what the model is all about, really?
So I think that fiction, not just science fiction, but fiction is a way for human beings to explore ideas and possibilities outside of the restrictions of um, uh, actual real events or real circumstances. And so whether it's Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, right,
Mm,
exploring social mores within those families, or it's super intelligence exploring what it is to have an AI. Like in both cases, as human beings, we're using a medium of storytelling to be able to have people become more thoughtful about a set of issues that are relevant to them.
mm,
In fact, actually, the history of science fiction really is very closely tied to contemporary social issues when those pieces of fiction were written.
mm.
Um, so I don't think we need less science fiction. I think there's a healthy set of concerns that are being raised by science fiction about AI. Um, but I also think that you have a challenge in the narrative of form that you want there to be conflict. And so, we're not going to have a story. I give you an example. There's a whole series of books that were written around the turn of the last century, the 1800s. Jeremy Bentham is one such writer, and
Mm.
they wrote these utopian novels. But the problem with the utopian novel is that there's nothing that ever happens.
No.
And so the dystopian novel became a much more popular
Oh yeah.
form of fiction because you had conflict, you had something interesting
So
going on.
back to religions. That was my problem. When you're going to heaven, so what am I going to do? Just go around singing, or no, no. But that's the point. The dystopia is much more interesting because you have a challenge to get out of, right?
Yeah, yeah. So I don't think we should expect that that somehow suddenly Hollywood's going to say, "Hey, let's create really boring movies." That's not really going to work out well for them as a business model.
No, but I think that my point is also there's this whole. I think some of the people in Silicon Valley and in big tech are dreaming of are also affected by these Hollywood ideas of wanting to build these. I think the whole idea of AGI is a Hollywood fantasy that's
I
been
guess it
put into
depends on how
words
you
too quickly.
define AGI.
Yeah, but that's the point, right? But then no one wants to really define it. It just moves like this is, something we know what is. Everyone seems to know it intuitively. That's my point. If you say artificial general intelligence, everyone's thinking some kind of sci-fi, right? Aren't you? You're not, Ted?
No, no. I guess maybe I'm too deep and
I would expect you to be.
down the rabbit hole. I think that there are a couple of useful definitions of artificial general intelligence. I think the first useful definition is, can I ask a machine to perform an arbitrary task or provide me with an arbitrary piece of information, which, if I were to find the best human on the planet to be able to do that, the response from the machine would be equivalent.
Mm.
So, in other words, a machine is, and I think this is the difference today, is if there's an area of you have absolute expertise in, the machine is probably not as good at that thing as you are. But everything else, it's better already than you, right?
Yeah,
So
but
we
the
have
problem
sort
is
of,
it's not falsifiable what you're saying, right? So I can always say there's a smarter guy in China somewhere.
well, but so I think, I guess the point of artificial general intelligence is, though, that the machine would be really good at just about everything. Um,
Yeah.
as opposed to good at certain things and bad at certain things, right? And so we're sort of progressing toward that, right? I think all of the advances over the last several, I mean, more than 2 years, right? 2 years is just since we had this Chat GPT interface, but if we go back further to the Transformer paper in 2017, really, we've been at this now for 7 or 8 years, or 10 years, really, since the research work to create the Transformer started even before that. Right? Transformers have been this huge advance over the systems that were before that, which were, I mean, I did natural language processing research when I was in college in the 1980s. And fundamentally, some of the same mathematical approaches were interesting then, are interesting still in what we're doing today. We just have more computation, more complex algorithms, more data. But the result of all of that is that we're able to have the machines able to answer questions in ways that we would expect a human to answer them.
Yeah. But it just seems like all of the definitions end up being non-identifiable. I cannot say now I have, and everyone will not agree that it's there because we'll be like, no, I don't like the response it made, so I don't think it's
Isn't that
responding.
true of talking to humans?
Yeah, it is, but then we were created by God, right?
So you say.
No, I don't say that, but there is this. Then you'll have some techno guys saying one thing, right? Some tech bros or something saying now it is, and a lot of other people saying no, it isn't, and then it becomes a vote, right? Is this AGI or is this not AGI? And that's
Yeah, well, look,
it
I mean, you
doesn't
have the same
seem
problem
like a
with consciousness. I
scientific
have no
concept.
evidence that you're a conscious being.
No, but it just doesn't seem like an analytical concept, right? To some extent, that's my annoyance with it. Doesn't seem scientific. It seems very opinionated, right?
Wouldn't you say the same thing about all of your interactions with human beings? I mean, and I think actually this is one of the challenges of human society is that we have a tendency to objectify others, and so your tribe, you look at within your tribe, you look at the other people and they're similar to you, and so you ascribe them with certain qualities, and then you look at somebody who's outside your tribe who maybe dresses differently or looks differently or talks differently, and you're like, well, they're not human, right? They're and this has been a problem of human society for ever, still is today, of people objectifying and dehumanizing others. So it's also not scientific. Like, what is the scientific proof that I should be ascribed the same rights as people who are from your tribe?
Yeah.
I
But
speak no Danish.
my point is, I can say this is an automation tool because it automates a process, right? Click, 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 click on the screen, right? I cannot say this is AGI because this is, I believe that it will be an I believe thing, right? That's just the point. But I love the way that I think this episode, more than almost any episode I've had so far, is really for me, or maybe that's just the ways I'm going with it as well. Is really about reflecting on how does AI mirror humanity all the time. What is it that we do that they do differently? How all religion, civilization. We've been around a lot of things already in these 50 minutes, Ted, around how it mirrors us in different ways, right? And I think that's the biggest. That is perhaps right now I'm thinking the most exciting thing about this. That the story it's telling about us is that's truly exciting, isn't it? It's a story. That's what you said. Also, the 2-year-old, what was it? Niece? No, granddaughter.
Grandson.
Yeah, grandson. Yeah. So it's about him growing up, and then it's reflecting on him as well. It's a story about humans. Oh, yeah. Anyway, that was poetic, maybe. But I think I want to ask you another question, right? So we're currently in the AI stage of what I used to call for the internet the Napster period. Something we're downloading stuff, we're doing things the wrong way because no one. I'm not saying it's illegal, but we didn't invent Spotify or Netflix yet. So what do you think that in the end these formats will be the winners? Do you have an idea about what's coming up? You are the COO of a big, West Coast tech company, so AI company. So what's the future going to be like?
Well, I think that we should expect that there will be new model algorithms, right? And there are a number that are quite interesting already. point one out to your listeners, liquid AI is sort of an interesting alternative approach to the transformer algorithm. And I think we'll see more and more alternatives, alternative algorithms. Secondly, I think that the construct of a set of components that work together will become more important than any single model. And so that construct may include multiple models, other kinds of tools, and so it's the way in which all of that is orchestrated that is actually going to become more important. And then thirdly, I think the way in which that those capabilities are distributed across the compute fabric is going to become super important. And what I mean by that is that we will have a certain amount of processing power in many of our everyday objects, and certainly in the everyday objects that are the biggest and most important in our lives. So we may have a little bit in our television monitor. We'll have more in our phone. We'll have even more in our car. We'll have even more in expensive piece of machinery that's operating in our factory. And so you start thinking about all of that compute and the way in which it's going to interact with each other. So you'll have some very large models and large systems, AI systems, that are only capable of being run on a supercomputer. And that isn't going to be necessarily what people use to get things done every day. I may actually use a very small model that's running on my phone to get a particular task done. But that small model on the phone may communicate with the very large model so that when it encounters something it can't handle, it actually has a reference back to a more powerful model to be able to interact with.
Silicon becomes the norm to some extent, right? The silicon becomes the norm. The computer is everywhere, and we become the abnormity.
Well, and we don't have to go down the path of what does the cyborg future look like when the silicon is embedded, but yeah.
No, but I think that's interesting with the computer and everything, but that's also the IoT aspect to some extent, is that everyone talked about some years back as well, right? That's coming back and becoming bigger with this, right?
Absolutely.
But then you see these toothbrushes with AI. You've seen those, right, as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Are they just ahead of time, or is
Well, I mean, I think that there are probably use cases for which the
misunderstood in their time.
Yeah. Every time I go to the dentist, my dentist is like, "Oh, you must use an electronic toothbrush. You brush your teeth are so clean." And I'm like, "No, I just brush very vigorously with a regular old plastic toothbrush."
I actually changed this year to an electric toothbrush for the first time. One of my friends, he bought one that was crazily expensive, and he was like, "It's the best thing I've ever done." So I said, "Okay, I'll do it." And honestly, it's good. It has to be one of those, sonic pulse one thing, something like that. Sure. That works. Anyway, but I'm just, the thing is, what I'm also getting at is that a lot of people are imagining how the world will look in 25 years, like with AI toothbrushes, like you're saying right now. And then I think a lot of companies are sort of saying, okay, if this will be in 25 years, let's do it tomorrow instead. Do you think? And also what you said, you'll have the deterministic things that will do things first, and then you'll have actions with low consequences and with human in the loop, and then the whole progression of this, right? Of how we'll do AI in the future and AI agents. Do you think people should be worried they're not taking too long steps too quickly, or is there a rhyme and reason to the pace of this? Right, that's my point.
Well, I progress doesn't happen by sitting and watching. Progress happens by doing. So it's hard to draw the line on saying where I should do up to this line, not past that line. It's very hard to define where that line is. I think two constraints, though. One is computational power, right? So you may very much want to download the 405 billion parameter llama model, but you're going to have a hard time getting enough compute power to run it as an individual, right? And so where will we be 25 years from now? Well, you may have that compute power on your watch.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one interesting question about like when should we do things, or how should we pursue things? There are things that I live in the future. I live in San Francisco. I rode the elevator down from my condominium to street level and hopped in a Waymo self-driving car, which took me to the train station where I boarded a fully electric train
Do
that
you have
has
a digital
Wi-Fi.
driver's license, Ted?
I do still have a driver's license. I'm old.
Is it? But do you have a digital driver's license?
Oh, do I have a digital one? Yes. Yeah. California has a digital driver's
Oh
license
crap! Do you
program
have
now.
digital ID and do you have all that? Oh, really?
Yeah,
Digital
absolutely.
invoicing?
Everything. Everything's
Oh, okay.
digital.
I'm
Everything's
just testing
electronic.
it. Who's
I'm
really
not
most
even
in the
physical.
future?
Look, my hand goes right through my other hand.
You're not even physical. No, you're just a voice in people's head right now as well.
No, but my point is to reflect that, as has been said many times before, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed, right?
Mm,
The experiments that people are going to do, there are going to be people who are trying to run completely autonomous agents to perform complex tasks
mm,
long before the rest of us, or the 99% of us, feel like that's a safe thing to do.
yeah.
But should they go and do it? Yeah, absolutely, because otherwise we'll never figure out how it's safe to do. Should they do it in a constrained way that doesn't launch nuclear weapons to destroy the entire planet? Yeah,
Please, yes.
let's make sure the nuclear weapons are under lock and key.
Yeah. You're right, but it's just this whole, people are when you say AI, there's this AI. Well, then we have something that can just do things immediately, and now I expect it tomorrow, and let's do this tomorrow, right? That's also, and now I think just now there's a trend to change when we're coming on 2025, where people are like, okay, we probably need to get our data in order as well. Oh, we also need to a process says, what do we want to do? Oh, we need to align it. Oh, crap. It was not just enough to give people access to a productivity chatbot. Can we even measure the productivity we got from the productivity chatbots? What are people using the time for? What's going on? So all of that is sort of, coming to the fore again. So that's basically my point. People being like, should be more wary that even though we can envision a future in 25 years, it doesn't mean it will be there tomorrow. We'll need to do all of the tedious steps, all the testing and trying, all of the generation changes in our workplace as well, right?
Yep.
Because not everyone lives in the future, Ted. But Ted, I'm always also extremely pleased to have you on the show, because you always, and I think also that comes to the fore. It's clear from this conversation that you write with a deeper, slightly more philosophical perspective, and you also think that way. And I love that. I love that one of your latest articles actually had Søren Kierkegaard quote in it,
Yeah.
which, I'm Danish, so that was
Yeah,
like
you love
points
that
points in the
reference to
book.
Kierkegaard. I wish I could say that I did it for you, but that
Yeah,
was.
but I actually thought, did he do this for me? That's really next one. There'll be a Karen Blixen thing or something like that. But I really love that, because we've had a lot of philosophical perspective also on the podcast. So I'd love to just ask you, because I always that's the way I approached it in university. Always trying to figure out what does my professor think about right now, instead of what are they explaining to everyone in their PowerPoints, but what are they actually puzzled about right now? What are you puzzled about right now, Ted? What puzzles someone in the future?
What puzzles me? I think I guess the thing that I spend a lot of my time thinking about is the point that you were just raising a moment ago, which is about how we actually adapt our human civilization to the advent of the intelligent machine. And there are many puzzles to sort out about um, how we change our behaviors, how we change our processes, how we so one of the things that I think people in my industry love to say out loud is that nobody wants to wash the dishes. That was something that Soren said on your last
Yeah, no one
podcast,
wants to
right?
do the dishes. Yeah, exactly. He was
Um,
this constant. Yeah.
and I think by and there are other formulations of that same statement of like, oh well, nobody wants to sit there and do boring clerical work. Nobody wants to, But on the other hand, like maybe we're a little too arrogant in the way that we think about what our fellow human beings are comfortable doing, because actually, uh, you can imagine a person who goes to the office, knows what the tasks are that they need to do to get through the day, does those tasks, leaves, does not think about work before they get there, does not think about work after they leave, because their passion is art or their family
Mm,
or their civic societies that they participate in, and so they're pouring all of their intellect and their passion into these non-work related things.
mm,
Perfectly happy to do the work thing, move the number from one spreadsheet to another all day long, because that just pays the bills. And so I think we have a challenge in that people like you and I find an enormous amount of fulfillment in the business activities that we engage in, and a lot of people don't. And so we shouldn't take our expectations for the way the world should be and simply project them onto others. And so I think that that's going to be one of the biggest challenges we think about this adaptation, is that we're not all the same. We all have different interests and passions, and how are we going to, as a society, navigate from a stable point now to a future stable point in all of the chaos that's going to happen in between? It's going to be very, very challenging.
Yeah, it is, and it's also, someone said a year ago, I can't remember where, but that at some event I was at, I can't remember, but that we're removing friction everywhere in society all the time. Someone has an idea that good design, good life is removing friction, right? So we have touchless supermarkets and all that, right? And I'm not sure I actually, when I think about it, agree with it. I accept it because it's efficient every time I go through it. So I do it as well. If I can go just walk through the shop without having to talk to anyone, I just move, quick move back, get home, right? But then I thought the other day about going to the post office. We almost don't have that in Denmark anymore because everything's digital. And I never say hi to that post lady. I never go to the bank and ask for banknotes and have that little chit chat, stand in a line there and just accept to stand there without doing anything. And I don't know. I feel like I'm a 40-year-old boomer, right? But it feel, but I don't know. You get my point, right? It just are the value in these small frictions. Is that where we learn to behave and be polite, and realize that there are other people around us that we need to build value together with, right? And if no one wants to do the dishes, yeah, hey, hell, I'll do the dishes if Ted does it with me, because I think we'll have a brilliant conversation while we're doing the dishes, Ted. I honestly think that. But what if we automate it? Me and Ted will never do the dishes.
Yeah, it's examples like that though that make me think of Socrates, and of course, reported in writing by Plato that Socrates was opposed to writing, which is sort of of course, an interesting historical fact that we know that Socrates was opposed to writing because someone wrote it down. But anyway, but Socrates, felt that our intellectual interactions would be harmed by writing, because it would mean that we didn't have to remember, and thus by not remembering, we wouldn't think as deeply about things. And the reason I use that example is that Socrates was looking at the world through the perspective of the world he knew and existed in, and the values that he had, and looking at this new thing, all this crappy people writing things down, and
Paper.
and saying how terrible it was, right? And so you're just doing the same thing, right? You're saying, oh well, I grew up in a world in which I talked with the postman, and now these young kids don't know what they're doing. They never talk to the postman. So I was like, really? So you don't think they're going to find some other way of
They are.
living with each other?
They are. Yeah, they are. But
It's maybe Twitch, but
maybe they won't, right? That's also maybe they just won't, right? We think that things will continue, but maybe they won't, right? It's just a fear, right? You'll it's natural to have that fear, isn't it? Also with
no, actually, it's very rooted in your Protestant upbringing to think apocalyptically. Actually, it's not a common thing.
Really? Oh yeah. They bring it up again. Thank you. You're smiling. Do you mean that? You don't mean that, Ted, do you?
I do mean that. I do. No, look, your upbringing taught you to think about the universe in a particular frame, which includes an apocalyptic element. That isn't a necessary way for human beings to think.
But that okay. Now I'd say that okay. But if you go all of the natural religions, almost all of, maybe not the Native Americans, or not Indian, Native American ones, but most of them had titans, right? Chaos, and they all ended up winning or breaking free or doing something like that. The Norse had that. The Greeks had that. They're all these crazy titans, right? Chaos, apocalyptic.
I think most religions had a notion of balance between forces of good and forces of evil, or forces of order versus forces of chaos, right? And I think it's because, and I know you're going to ask me this question, so I will preempt it, of the only constant. But this is a perfect segue to my only constant.
Oh, okay. So, but let's just before we just go there, just one final question, right? And I think because I also think that the privacy thing, that there's this whole. I think when I studied history, I talked about how privacy created modernity to some extent. I had some thoughts I had around that the creation of the private room and created liberty as well, and something where you could do things, because in the Middle Ages everything sort of constantly interfered. You had ghosts and you had leprechauns and you had religion. Everything moved in across your domains. But suddenly the private room came and you could do things, you could own things, you could be yours, right? But now we're giving things up to a hive mind, and I know this also, to some extent, and I'm taking a very special route into it. But that's also what you're building Inflection on, isn't it? Right now, is to say that we shouldn't just give everything up to a hive mind, but sometimes you want to, borrow our model, right? Is then also part of what we should look at for the future, right? To retain privacy and not just give everything to a hive mind. Or what do you think?
I think that privacy is a result, not a cause. I think that if you look at the progression of natural philosophers, and perhaps most familiar to all of us would be the Declaration of Independence, which certainly had a profound impact in bringing those natural philosophers' ideas to all of us around the world, because it put them into a very specific political framing. That what we experienced progressing from the Middle Ages into modernity is the recognition of individuals' ability to pursue their own happiness. Put in a very simplified form. This wasn't always so, right? The human order for many millennia was you are dedicated to the tribe that you are a part of, and your being and your actions are subordinate to that group. And that change from being subordinate to a group to being able to have our own wishes and our own desires and our own fulfillment, our own aspirations, right? That Maslow's hierarchy of needs that allows us to say, oh, well, there is some self-actualization at the top of this pyramid that I am capable of reaching, right? That is actually more a cause of than the desire for privacy than the other way around.
So on an enterprise level, is that an argument for saying just share your data to become more in balance with things? Or
well, I guess my point is I think
I'm making a crazy analogy here. I'm
sharing
sorry.
my data is infringing upon my ability to self-actualize is wrong, right? I think in fact, so if we look at the difference between sort of a pre-networked workforce versus the workforce today, where information flows fluidly, right? There was the notion, if you go back to the 1960s and 70s, that the power in an organization accrued to those that were gatekeepers and information hoarders. And what we think of today is that actually those are the two worst things you can do. That actually what you should be is fluidly networking and being a connector, and fluidly sharing and exchanging information, because actually being an interchange point is more valuable than being the hoarder. So I think we've already actually made the transition from control to interaction, and AI is merely a new facilitation of that interaction.
That's a great point, and I think now we'll get to the final question, Ted. This has been a really, really terrific conversation, and it's taken a lot of deep. And actually, I'm gonna have tons of questions also when I re-listen to this episode. I already wrote down tons of notes on my paper. I have a paper all the time, and I just can't catch them all in this. Because then it should be like 3-hour episodes, right, Ted? But maybe we'll do a
Well, Lex Friedman, of course, insists upon his subject sitting for 3 hours. I think it's
maybe I should start doing that, right? But I think maybe we can do a follow up in a year or two or something. I love that. But Ted, I have one final question. Are you ready for it?
I am.
So, Ted, what is the only constant?
Humans are constantly in search of understanding their existence and finding their place in the grand scheme of things, which I think is actually a really nice way to wrap up a lot of the things we've talked about today, because I think it is a thing that sets humans and machines apart. We are striving to understand, whether it's with the Protestant religious background that you have, or the Native Americans that I referenced, or any of the other world religions. It's those ideas emerge because we're trying to make sense of the world around us and what our place in it we have. But I did ask Pi to reflect on what that human desire for meaning might mean in an age with artificial intelligence, and I want to read you what Pi had to say. The continuous search for meaning compels humans to delve into the depths of their humanity while embracing the immense potential of AI. Together, we navigate an uncharted future where the boundaries of intelligence are redefined and the pursuit of understanding remains the one constant in a world of rapid change. The evolving relationship between humans and artificial intelligence serves as a catalyst for deeper introspection and adaptation, ensuring that the quest for purpose and understanding endures as a guiding light.
That's a great constant, Ted, and a great answer by Pi, and a very, I like that. It's a good one. It also very much encapsulates our conversation today. Actually, it actually feels like it was designed for this conversation right now. So thank you very much for that, and thank you so much for being on The Only Constant. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
You've listened to The Only Constant, a podcast sponsored by Basico.